You're standing at the edge of a desert. Behind you, the most powerful empire in the world. Ahead of you, nothing but sand, rock, and heat. You have 2 million people who have never known anything but chains. And God is telling you to walk. This is not a myth. This is one of the most staggering journeys in human history. And the reason it took 40 years to cross a desert you could walk in 2 weeks tells you everything about what God was actually doing. For 400 years, your ancestors lived as slaves in Egypt. The brutal kind. The kind where Pharaoh orders your newborn sons thrown into the Nile. You built cities with your hands. You built wealth for someone else. You were property. Then Moses appeared, an Israelite raised inside Pharaoh's own palace, a man who spent 40 years in the desert before God spoke to him from a burning bush. God did not choose a general or a politician. He chose a shepherd who stammered when he talked. 10 plagues fell on Egypt. Scholars like John Currid have shown that each plague directly targeted a specific Egyptian deity. The Nile turning to blood was not random. The Nile was a god. By the time 3 days of darkness fell while Israelite homes stayed lit, Pharaoh had already lost. Then came Passover, the blood of a lamb on doorframes, the angel of death moving through Egypt. The firstborn of the most powerful empire on earth fell silent in a single night. Pharaoh broke. 2 million slaves walked out of Egypt carrying gold and silver pressed into their hands by their former captors. But then Pharaoh changed his mind. 600 chariots came after them, and the Israelites stood at the edge of the Red Sea with nowhere to go. Moses lifted his staff. The sea split. 2 million people walked across on dry ground. The Egyptian army followed. The waters returned. And on the other side, for the first time in 400 years, no master, no whip, just open sky. The destination was Canaan, promised to Abraham centuries before. By the most direct route, 11 days away. It took 40 years. God did not lose the map. He was building something that Egypt had destroyed. He was rebuilding a people. Because what you carried out of Egypt was not just gold. You carried the psychology of a slave. 400 years of someone else telling you who you were. You did not know how to govern. You did not know how to fight. You did not know how to worship a God you could not see or touch. Kenneth Bailey, a scholar who spent decades studying the biblical text, argued that the wilderness was not a punishment. It was a school. Manna fell from the sky every morning. Water came from a rock. A pillar of cloud led by day. A pillar of fire led by night. Every single day, the provision showed up. Every single day, it asked the same question. Do you trust me? You did not always answer well. At Sinai, while Moses was on the mountain receiving the law, the people melted down Egyptian jewelry and built a golden calf. Weeks after watching the Red Sea split. Because 400 years of watching Egypt worship idols had shaped the way you understood the divine. That kind of conditioning does not unlearn itself in 11 days. God gave the law at Sinai, not to control you, to define you. Scholar N.T. Wright has written that the Mosaic Covenant was God's constitution for a nation that had never had one. Laws about justice, laws about rest. The Sabbath alone was revolutionary. In Egypt, you never stopped working. Now, God commanded you to rest one day out of 7. Not as a reward, as a declaration that you were not a production machine. You were a people made in the image of God. Then 12 spies entered Canaan to scout the land. 10 came back and said, "The people there are giants. We looked like grasshoppers next to them. The whole congregation wept. They wanted to go back to Egypt, and God said, "All right, this generation will not enter. You will wander until you die out here, but your children will walk in." 2 spies had given a different report, Caleb and Joshua. They had seen the same giants and said, "God is with us. We can do this." They were the only ones who carried a different story inside their chests, and they were the only ones from that generation who made it. This is the moment the wilderness became intentional. The generation that knew Egypt had to pass. Not because God was cruel, because they could not fully inhabit a future their minds had never allowed them to imagine. Freedom is not just a place. It is a posture. And 40 years in the wilderness was the slow, grace-filled work of teaching a slave people how to stand like free ones. A new generation grew up who had never carried a brick for Pharaoh. They grew up watching God provide, watching God fight. By the time Moses stood on Mount Nebo and looked out over the Jordan River, the people below him were not the terrified former slaves who had crossed the Red Sea. They were something entirely new. Moses did not cross the Jordan. One act of disobedience had cost him entry. He saw the land from the mountain. He died looking at the promise. And even in that, there is something true. Sometimes you carry something all the way to the edge, and someone else walks in. That is not failure. That is a relay race. Joshua led them across. The Jordan River stopped at flood stage. The walls of Jericho fell after 7 days of marching and one shout. And God's people entered the land promised to their ancestors before any of them were born. So when you read that it took 40 years, stop counting the days. Count the mornings the manna appeared. Count the times God answered complaint with water and patience instead of abandonment. Count the generation that died in the sand so their children could walk on grass. You're not reading about a march through a desert. You're reading about the architecture of transformation, about what it costs to make free people out of slaves. And if you sit quietly with that long enough, you might notice something about your own life, about the seasons that felt like detours, about the years that looked like wandering, about the things you had to unlearn before you were ready to receive what was waiting. The Israelites did not find the promised land at the end of a short road. They found it at the end of themselves. And maybe that is exactly where God intended it to be all along.